I want to talk about some dynamics within this so-called South American post-neoliberalism. And this is just from a regional perspective, and this is a work in process. I just started to look at the dynamic of Mercosur and the recent developments in South American cooperation, focusing on the case of Argentina and the changes that these regional dynamics has entailed for Argentina. I have some questions about what happened after the crisis of neoliberal reforms, and especially about this left turn or pink tide in Latin America, and the idea that this somehow was a clean break with neoliberalism and a challenge to the historical region's dependency on the global economy. I won't describe arguments about the South American left turn or the nature of the new developmentalism that Henry mentioned yesterday. Some of the arguments are well known. I only want to mention the notion that as a part of this debate, there is this idea that there is a new wave of regionalism in the region, which is, sorry about region, but it is said to be radically different from the open regionalism of the 90s, of what Mercosur was an example. This new post-neoliberal regional integration is said to go beyond trade to become part of this new developmentalist agenda for growth, social inclusion, and it includes cooperation between countries to reduce asymmetries, as in the case Gavin was talking about recently, prevent and also, and this is especially important for the Southern Cone countries, prevent the negative impacts of global imbalances on the region, build somehow a new Latin American political identity. And one important feature of this project is said to be the repoliticization of regional cooperation and the search for greater autonomy in the international arena for the country's development policies. So, taking the case of Argentina, I argue that there's no doubt that there have been very, very important changes in policies, institutional arrangements, forms of regional integration, but these changes have not eliminated the conditions that account for the country's dependent position in the global economy, especially those that make Argentina dependent on US dollar inflows and also make commodity exports a structural necessity to the country's development strategy. Very briefly, after the 2001 crisis, the Argentinian peso underwent a big devaluation, more than 300% in a few months, which in turn created conditions for the export boom of the mid-2000s and for a process of import substitution. Also, the state appropriated part of this extraordinary export profits through a tax on commodity exports, which delinked somehow domestic prices from the international prices of food, and also helped to address the critical fiscal deficit of the late 1990s. So after a period of intense instability, these changes resulted in extraordinary rates of growth with a sudden fall in unemployment and poverty and some reversals in the regressive distribution of wealth of the 1990s. But the mid-90s, Argentina seemed to square the circle of development to become a sort of miraculous recovery from neoliberal reforms, and also an example of the feasibility of post-neoliberal economic policies. It combined growing exports with a very dynamic domestic market, wage increases, fiscal spending, growth, higher levels of welfare, a combination that has considered to be impossible for Argentina, for commodity export countries in general, especially when these commodities are staple foods. And this was also explained in terms of the intelligent intervention of the state that was able to support manufacturing and spread welfare without affecting commodity exports. And it was in this context that Argentina strengthened its links to other Latin American countries and took part in the development of this new regional agenda for cooperation, including the creation of political regional institutions, UNASUR and CELAC, the most important of them. These institutions have had a role in the resolution of conflicts in the within and between countries of the region. It intervened in Bolivia, in conflicts between Peru and, Colombia and Venezuela, in Paraguay and Haiti with not so much luck. And it also participated in the definition of still to be seen new regional financial architecture. I mean, the Bank of the South that has not been, it's on the papers now, but nothing more than that. And some not very successful initiatives to reform the international financial architecture and to build a new regional financial architecture. It has been also involved in projects to develop regional infrastructure, which is meant to both growth and create better opportunities for accumulation in the region. Some of these projects are quite conflictive, like Brazilian-led projects to build infrastructure in Bolivia, in Ecuador, which have been surrounded by a lot of conflict. But this simply virtuous trajectory created the conditions for the exacerbation of distributive struggles that led to its own crisis. First of all, falling unemployment gave rise to more intense wage claims, which combined with growing consumption triggered inflation, also aggravated by rising prices of Argentina's export commodities. Inflation, in turn, affected the competitive advantages of domestic manufacturing brought about by the devaluation, and all this led to political tensions, to contradictory government actions that sought to address these divergent demands, which, among other things, involved massive state subsidies, like energy, indirect wages, subsidies to different manufacturing sectors, and also policies to boost consumption and attempts to quite unsuccessful attempts to control inflation, especially in the case of the prices of food. And when this domestic crisis was unfolding, the effects of the global crisis began to be felt in the country. So since 2009, there have been some periods of recession combined with some recoveries, which were quite different from the recoveries of the early 2000s, because these periods of recovery have been based on massive state spending, which resulted in further deterioration of the positive fiscal and external balances of the early 2000s, capital flight, more intensive distributive struggles, and very, very high inflation. Inflation rates are around 20-something% per year for the last 4 or 5 years. At this critical conjuncture, the government resorted to some minor actions to contain macroeconomic, external, and fiscal imbalances without being able to solve it in any meaningful way. I don't have time to describe these actions. Some of them were pretty, I'm almost done, pretty idiosyncratic, some of them even bizarre. I mean, anti-inflationary policies in Argentina are basically destroying the statistics about inflation. So official statistics are like less than 10% inflation, whereas the real figures must be nobody knows, around 25 or 30% per year. Also, this period of crisis was accompanied by the weakening of initiatives to cooperate with other South American countries and strengthen the independence of the region vis-a-vis the global economy, and by new efforts which haven't been seen since the late 1990s to attract foreign direct investments and portfolio investments, and also to rebuild the links to the global economy affected by the crisis and by the Argentinian government rhetorical and not so rhetorical challenges to globalization, finance, and imperialism of the mid-2000s. And there have been efforts to make up things with the IMF, with holdouts of that didn't accept the sovereign debt restructuring in 2006 and 2010, also with companies that were suing Argentina in international courts. So, and the government has taken pains to also to diffuse or repress conflict associated with large initiatives in mining, oil, agribusiness, and at the same time has been attempting to appropriate part of the profits from extractive industries to close the external and fiscal gaps. And what is interesting, it has been doing this, legitimizing these initiatives with a developmentalist and nationalist discourse. I don't have time to mention something about the nationalization of the oil company, probably if it comes up in the later, I'll mention it. What I want to say to close is that this dynamic is important to consider, that there is also a domestic dynamics in which transnational corporations and transnational logic has opportunities to make the day in the countries of the South. It is not something that comes from without. And the other important point, and this is what I want to work from now on, is that this new stage of internationalization of the Argentinian economy has been accompanied by some new political configurations of discourses that emphasize the autonomy of the nation and the region vis-a-vis globalization, which is central to make sense of the tensions and contradictions in the relocalization of the region's economies within the global economy, and to understand the characteristics of what I think is a new stage in the internationalization of Latin American states by post-neoliberal means. Well, and to finish with, this is also important to somehow reconsider our optimism about South America and recent developments in the region. Okay.